The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Close U.S. ally Saudi Arabia has now proposed hosting a male-only Olympics in a joint bid, which would have the neighboring country of Bahrain hosting the women's events, whereas Saudi Arabia would only host men's events because, obviously, it's Saudi Arabia. Prince Fahad bin Jalawi Al Saud, an international relations consultant to the Saudi Arabian Olympic Committee, proposed having gender-segregated games in an interview with a French sports website. He says that the Olympic Committee passed some new rules in the Olympic Agenda 2012 reform package, and that a joint segregated bid involving two countries would be allowed, but International Olympic Committee President Thomas Bach quickly dismissed the idea, telling the Associated Press that Saudi Arabia would be ineligible for the bid unless it complies with rules that ban discrimination against women in sports. Did not matter to Prince Fahad, who maintained that doing an Olympic proposal with another country jointly would be a possibility. We could envisage it with Bahrain. We have always had a form of cooperation with that country. Since the vote on Agenda 2020, we could envisage a joint bid. Bahrain would hold the women's events. We would hold the men's competition. Yeah, right. I don't see this happening.
This is a joke. Saudi Arabia is an embarrassment to this planet. I can't believe that the idiots in Saudi Arabia think that this would fly in any way. Maybe they just like to talk about themselves. I think that's it.
When I hear something like this, I feel like saying, just go away, take your sincerely held religious beliefs about how women just can't, whatever it is, they just can't do it. And just don't talk to anybody else about it, because we're doing the Olympics in a country that allows women to participate, you know? And when we think about even the World Cup in Qatar and how any Jewish soccer players should be a little bit skittish about that, do you think we're going to have Olympics in a country that would not even allow women to participate? It's just so patently absurd.
And I'm not sure if they realize that at all. I understand why they would want it that way. But if they are unable to see why it would never happen, then they are clearly very confused at the very least.
Yeah, if they're being honest about how they feel that this would be a perfectly reasonable way to do the Olympics, it's bordering on North Korea style delusion that's completely disconnected from the empirical realities of this planet. Completely
delusional and completely narcissistic, maybe megalomaniacal.
All right, as we know, Republicans and conservatives are always very concerned. Lewis throwing in megalomaniacal. I like that. That's making me laugh. Republicans and conservatives are always very concerned, Lewis, about balancing the budget, curbing excess spending, being financially responsible, and it's all pretty much a joke, as we know and as we've explored on this program for many years. But it is also about states' rights, as they say, Lewis, and the right for sovereign states to make decisions and blah, 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 blah. And according to a new study by the Tax Foundation, the 7 states that take in the most federal dollars all have one thing in common. They all voted Republican in the 2012 presidential election. The Tax Foundation summed it up by saying, though taxes are the most common and recognizable source of state government revenues, it's important to remember that they're not the only source. In fact, state governments received 31.5% of their total revenue from transfers from the federal government in the 2012 fiscal year. The number varies pretty significantly for specific states. For example, Mississippi gets 45% of its total state general revenues from the federal government. Also on the high end are Louisiana, Tennessee, South Dakota, and Missouri. The states that use the most federal aid are the same states that voted Republican in presidential elections. According to a 2010 study by the Fourth Branch, there is a very strong correlation between a state voting for Republicans and receiving more in federal spending. No surprise, Lewis, that those in blue states are subsidizing the red states with regard to federal taxes, often paying out more than they take in federal revenues. Same thing that we've been talking about for a while. A lot of talk about fiscal conservatism and personal responsibility. And we see those liberal blue states that can't even balance the budget, apparently, supporting these red states that vote for Republicans and seem to rely on the federal government.
Without the blue states, these states would look like, what would they look like? There would probably be no schools, no infrastructure. It would be
a libertarian's dream, wouldn't it?
Total chaos if they did not have the support of the blue states.
When Republican candidates like Mitt Romney talk about the takers, they're disproportionately talking about red states, even though they would never admit that. Maybe they don't even know that.
Yeah. Maybe they think that, of course, to some extent, these red states are putting in some of that money. But yeah, I'm not sure where they get their numbers from.
Isn't this more evidence that the supply side right-wing economics that are touted election year in and election year out by the Republican Party simply do not work? We already know that we don't have economic data that suggests that. And now we are increasingly becoming aware of the fact that we don't have tax data that supports that those policies work either.
We have states that have been doing the same types of things for decades, maybe close to a century, and it's always been a disaster. They continue to suffer, and I'm not sure what they're thinking.
There's a lot of talk from the pro-gun crowd, the more guns in every instance crowd, that defensive gun ownership and defensive gun usage is a really significant thing. And there's a really interesting article by former guest Evan DeFilippis and Devin Hughes at Politico that talks about what they describe as the myth of gun ownership. The myth being that millions of gun owners successfully use their firearms to defend themselves and their families from criminals. And as Evan and Devin have figured out, there is no academic support in public health literature for this myth. This myth is the single largest motivation for gun ownership, according to a Gallup study. So when we talk about why does it matter if people incorrectly believe that millions of guns are used defensively successfully every year, it matters because it is the number one cited reason for gun ownership, according to a Gallup study. So the myth comes from, back in 1992, Gary Kleck and Mark Getz, who are criminologists at Florida State University. They did a random digital dial survey to establish how many defensive gun uses there are in the United States. And when I tell you how they did it, you will realize how ridiculous it is. They surveyed 5,000 people, asking them, have you used a firearm in self-defense in the last year? And if so, what was the reason? And what was the effect of using the firearm? 66 incidents of defensive gun use were reported from the sample of 5,000. The researchers then just took those findings and extrapolated them to suggest that between 1 and 2.5 million defensive gun uses per year is a fair number to estimate. This has now turned into gospel for gun advocates who talk about how much guns are used defensively. And if I don't have to explain it to you because you already get why that's an absurd claim to make based on that study, then I'm glad. But I know that there will be people who don't realize why this is so absurd. So I'll explain it to them as Evan DeFilippis and Devin Hughes do in this Politico article. Okay. 1997. David Hemingway, a professor of health policy at the Harvard School of Public Health, offered the first kind of rebuttal to this so-called research. First, there is something called the social desirability bias, which is that respondents would falsely claim that their gun has been used for its intended purpose to ward off a criminal to validate their initial purchase. A respondent might also exaggerate facts to say that a use of a firearm was a so-called defensive use when in reality it was not. And again, you're just asking people. There is nothing actually linking the claims from individuals to any actual records of such defensive gun use. Second, there's this problem of gun owners responding strategically. There are millions of members of the NRA in the United States and other gun groups They are probably all aware of the debate around guns. So they would have a reason that they would exaggerate or straight up lie about defensive gun use. Number 3 is the risk of false positives from something called telescoping, which is where respondents might recall an actual self-defense use that's outside the time frame. So some of these 5,000 respondents, 66 of whom said they were involved in a defensive gun use, they were asked, have you had a defensive gun use in the last year? And if they actually had a gun use that was defensive a year and a half prior, that would be telescoping, and it would drastically skew the data, especially when it's being extrapolated to the entire population of the country. These are the sorts of biases, Lewis, which make the study worthless. And when you look at the complete lack of rigor, scientific rigor that's applied here, you say, okay, it's pretty obvious to me, but we'll just ignore that study. But then the so-called study is touted as gospel by groups like the NRA and so many others. And when you say a lie often enough, it becomes the truth in the minds of so many.
That's true. And it doesn't help when gun owners or people who want to be gun owners are watching the news and all they hear about and see is there's a murder here, there's a shooting there, robbery here, violent crime there. It adds to this climate of fear, and people think they need guns because of that. I just got into it with an employee of mine who has 2 young kids, mind you, keeps 2 shotguns under the bed, guns in the nightstands. You know, her life is just completely governed by fear, but she's never had to use these guns, of course, and she probably never will.
And again, the fact that the study is unsound doesn't mean that there are no defensive gun uses. It just means that the study that people point to quantify the number of defensive gun uses is completely bogus and worthless to us. So let's remember that next time we hear that talking point come out. Some good news with regard to animal extinction. We talked to you about the unfortunate story of how we are down to only 1 male breeding white rhino in the world, and that's yet another great species that we have almost pushed to extinction. Good news from New Delhi, where the number of tigers has seen a sharp rise in India to 2,226 tigers from only 1,400 7 years ago. India is now home to 70% of the world's tigers, according to Environment Minister Prakash Javadekar. Karnataka has the most tigers at 406. Uttarakhand has 340 tigers, and Tamil Nadu has 229. From an estimated 100,000 tigers at the beginning of the 20th century, India saw the number drop to 1,411 tigers in 2008. Most of the animals killed by poachers to sell the carcasses for usage in traditional Chinese medicine. And now, due to conservation efforts and breeding efforts, we have basically seen the number of tigers almost double in India. This is really good news, but the sad part of it is how hard we as humans have to work to keep animals from going extinct.
It's true. And it's a little bit different with a species like this because they can be a dangerous one. And I think I remember reading or hearing recently that attacks in India by tigers have been on the rise, tigers attacking people. And so you've got people defending their animals and themselves from tigers, killing them. On the other hand, you know, the tortoises and the sea turtles and the rhinos, and we seem to be losing the battle in conserving those species.
And I think it's perfectly fair, as you're kind of alluding to, Lewis, to talk about overpopulation in particular animal populations. We've seen the wild boar issue that has come up in much of the U.S. and the killing of livestock. I'm completely sensitive to that. But the broader, when we step back, the tiger story is a good illumination of how problematic human activities on Earth are. And I know that animals go extinct on their own. Animals went extinct before human industrialization took place. I get that, but the rate at which they're going extinct has accelerated drastically, and this is a really serious issue. And I think it's perfectly fine to say what you're saying, Lewis, that specific species coming back in terms of numbers actually may pose a threat, but we really need to look more broadly at the impact that humans are having on this planet with regard to climate, with regard to other species as well.
We of course have disrupted a balance, and I would of course like to see that restored as much as possible. I'm all about keeping every species we can alive, of course.
As we wrap up the first month of 2015, please consider becoming a David Pakman Show member. Our program is not funded by big corporations or media conglomerates. We are funded directly by our audience. The link between you listening to or watching our program and the program continuing is a direct link. We need funding from the audience to do this show. And thanks to the funding that we have, we've been able to grow the show over the last few years. Please check out davidpakman.com/membership and consider becoming a member today. And by the way, it's not just supporting the show. You also get great member benefits, including members-only programming that we do, the bonus show hosted by producer Lewis. I will tell you about today's bonus show a little bit later.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
This program is mostly funded by you, our audience, through the membership program. Today's new member of the day is Willa Gabrielle Cartwright. Willa Gabrielle Cartwright, thank you for being a David Pakman Show member. And to everybody else who became new members during the month of January, remember that in addition to supporting us through the membership program at davidpakman.com/membership, any shopping that you do on Amazon.com can also support us. If you first go to our website, davidpakman.com, and click on the Amazon banner on the right side of the page, click it, bookmark it, do your shopping. That's it. No forms to fill out, nothing else. 4 years ago this week, we discussed how Rand Paul wanted to cut $500 billion per year by getting rid of many programs that we actually need in a proposal that was so ridiculous, so absurd, that Rand's communication director had to issue a statement saying that it was not actually a satirical proposal. Rand Paul appears to be maybe ramping up for a presidential run. Will his policies resonate with people more or less than they did in the past, I wonder? This sort of libertarianism, this extreme libertarianism, has become very popular in certain enclaves, Lewis. But at the same time, broadly speaking, people are not really subscribing to this super anti-government point of view.
Yeah, when you lay it out for people, the approach is basically completely disassemble our government and let the free market decide everything. And I think even for people who have radical ideas about how we should do things, that still really doesn't resonate with them.
And the other thing that might be interesting about Rand Paul as a candidate is that even if the ideas don't resonate with people when presented in sort of plain language, Rand Paul is pretty clever and crafty with regard to his speaking skills and his kind of circular, dancing around objections in a way that some of the other Republican candidates of last election were not. So that might give him an advantage in terms of the optics of his being questioned about his views.
It's when you start asking him about the Civil Rights Act and things like that you really back him into a corner.
3 years ago this week, Newt Gingrich set up a robocall which accused Mitt Romney of forcing Holocaust survivors to eat non-kosher food. This really took robocalls to a new level, didn't it?
It did, yeah. This was one of the crazier ones, but we pretty much hate all of them equally.
And the FCC has kind of like guidelines about robocalls, and they're pretty weird. Number one is the FCC rules require a business to obtain your written consent. Number two, market research or polling calls to residential numbers are not restricted by FCC rules, nor are calls on behalf of tax-exempt nonprofit groups. As we know, a lot of politics is done under this umbrella of so-called tax-exempt nonprofit groups. And number three, informational messages such as school closings or flight information are permissible without any prior written consent. I'm not exactly sure which category campaign calls should fall into, but I think legally speaking, under the law, they fall under the calls from tax-exempt nonprofit groups, right?
It must be because there was nothing on this page specifically about campaigns or anything really political.
And some people think that robocalls are kind of going to go away because of the prevalence of cell phones, but I don't think so because I get robocalls on my cell phone all the time.
And I mean, you're starting to enter some gray area in terms of the legality of that. But at the same time, with everything we're doing on the internet and clicking on and forms we're filling out and emails we get, I mean, I guess it's possible that at some point, somehow, something got confused into thinking that we gave consent for some of these calls.
I wonder if you could argue that if someone only has a cell phone, that it is effectively their residential number in spite of the fact that it is not hardwired. And maybe you could say, because this is the only phone for this person, we should be allowed to call it or something like that.
You never know. Could this be the first presidential campaign that we see robotexts? It wouldn't surprise me.
No, it wouldn't surprise me whatsoever. 2 years ago this week, high-fructose corn syrup consumption plummeted in the United States amidst the backlash, which we are still kind of seeing today. Word of mouth, internet ads and articles played a big role in raising awareness about high-fructose corn syrup. A lot of companies started using better ingredients, but not all. Remember, Lewis, some were saying, hey, corn is natural, corn is good for you.
Yeah, I had a girlfriend at the time who I got into this discussion with, and I said, this stuff's terrible for you. But she says, I saw a commercial that said it was fine.
Yes, that commercial was sponsored by the corn lobby.
Yeah, I said, have you ever seen any other commercial telling you a food ingredient is okay to eat?
It's so funny because we've gotten so removed from actual real foods that there are discussions promoting or criticizing food additives, right? You would think that the conversation should be vegetables are good. Dark leafy greens should be in your diet 4 times a week. But that's not even the conversation. The conversation has become, oh, this additive is okay. This one is okay in this particular quantity. And even if you can make the argument, even if it's true that that additive is okay in a certain quantity, it just shows you how removed we've gotten from real food.
And in the case of this particular additive, the companies that didn't want to use higher quality ingredients just found a way to rename it. And now this happened late last year. Sometimes it will just say fructose. Sometimes it will just say fructose syrup. But in reality, it is just, once again, high fructose corn syrup.
I feel like so much of the focus around diet and nutrition and so much of all the stuff could really be simplified if people just said, I'm not going to eat processed foods with the exception of maybe I'm out and I have some dessert, or every once in a while I like to get this or that. If your general diet is, I'm going to eat as many non-processed foods as I can, I'm going to increase my consumption of vegetables, and I'm going to not overeat, you can mostly have whatever you want that falls under that umbrella within moderation, and it's going to be relatively healthy.
It's going to be, it will be relatively healthy. And, even at a lot of restaurants, you can still visit most of those restaurants and order almost anything on the menu. Of course, this is a lifestyle choice that might end up costing you a bit more money.
Certainly. And that's actually something very interesting. A book I recently read points out that in other countries, the percentage of people's income that is spent on food tends to be far higher than here in the US. And part of that is with such highly subsidized foods as corn. You put corn in everything, and because it's subsidized, it reduces the cost per calorie. That's part of why people are spending less on food here in the US. But it's also a priorities thing, which is that a lot of people would rather spend the money elsewhere. Could be interest on their car loan, or it could be whatever else. And it really is in part a priorities thing. Although, of course, Lewis, we don't want to write off the significance of people who actually have food insecurity because of an income issue.
Yeah, and people who live in certain areas of the country who might not even have access to, might not even have the option of getting that good quality fresh food.
Make sure to follow me on Twitter, twitter.com/dpacman. We have a great program for you today.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
We recently spoke about the conviction and sentencing of former anonymous member Barrett Brown, and I've received a bunch of inquiries over the last couple of months about whether we would have Glenn Greenwald on the program. We have tried to get him on the show recently, but he has been understandably pretty busy. We do actually have in our classic interview archive the last time we had Glenn Greenwald on the program. So this week's classic interview is Glenn Greenwald talking to us about Occupy, about catalysts for activism, and about a lot more. Glenn Greenwald is with us. He's author of the new book, With Liberty and Justice for Some. He's also a contributing writer over at Salon.com. And I want to talk to you, Glenn, about immunity and impunity in elite America, how the legal system was deep six and Occupy Wall Street swept the land. The most interesting point that I took from it is that income and wealth inequality have been present for a really long time in the United States. So that alone, even though it's kind of become the de facto number one cited reason for Occupy Wall Street, in your opinion, can't really be enough to have spurred this incredible coming together of events that are these protests. So, number one, what else has been a factor? But more interestingly, number two, why has that become such a convenient and popular number one reason that we're hearing?
Right. Well, it's not just that income inequality and wealth inequality have been in the United States for a long time, although that is true. What also is true is that it has been significantly increasing for several decades. So the trend line has been towards greater and greater levels of inequality. And yet you didn't really see a sustained protest movement over inequality. And I think the reason for that is because Americans are basically inculcated, for better or for worse, to accept not just the inevitability, but the virtues of inequality, of wealth inequality and outcome inequality. So, for example, when someone like Steve Jobs dies with $7 billion or $8 billion in net worth, even though huge amounts of joblessness and homelessness and foreclosures and the like are sweeping the land, most people don't begrudge that, because there's this sort of embedded political value in the United States that inequality is legitimate as long as it's fair and just. And I think that's really the key behind this protest movement, and what has so radically changed is the perception, obviously correct in my view, that these inequalities are no longer the byproduct of merit or hard work or deserved achievement, but instead is really the byproduct of cheating, of people shielding their ill-gotten gains, and most of all, using their superior political and financial power to exempt themselves from the rule of law, from the rules of society to which the rest of us are bound, so that these inequalities are no longer legitimate but are illegitimate. And I think that's really what's sustaining the protest, and one of the reasons why you don't hear much about that and why the media has an interest in portraying this as nothing more than just sort of anger over inequality unto itself is because one of the ways of demonizing the protest or dismissing it is to say that it's nothing more than this sort of socialist or communist anger from the 1960s over the fact that some people have a lot and lazy and worthless people have very little. And I think that's clearly not what the protest movement is about by and large. It's about the fact that, for example, the people who collapsed the world economy through their illegality and criminality have not paid any price, but instead have prospered.
You know, what I think is interesting is that there's several layers, actually, to the defenses and criticisms of Occupy Wall Street. And we've actually now seen on Twitter over the weekend, I got a ton of messages after a piece we did talking about media coverage of the Tea Party versus media coverage of Occupy Wall Street. And I got a serious email. It wasn't a parody. It wasn't sarcastic, saying, look at how many people have been arrested at Occupy Wall Street, and look at how many people were arrested at the Tea Party protest. You guys got to be nuts for thinking there's anything about the people happening at Occupy Wall Street. They're all getting arrested. And it's impossible for that. There's nothing I can say to that person to explain to them how actually the disparity in the arrests is indicative of the problem, not of how great the Tea Party is. I've lost that person, right? I can't bring them back.
Well, of course, that's true. And there's, but I will say this. One of the driving attributes of the Occupy movement that, in my view, makes it so worthwhile and compelling is that it really is a protest from the political and legal culture as a whole, from political and legal institutions. So it's really intended to exist outside of the legal framework. Whereas the Tea Party movement certainly there was lots of civil disobedience going on there. People were bringing guns. It was much more threatening and disruptive in its own way. But I think that the Occupy movement really was intended and is intended to purposely create a space that doesn't exist within our prevailing legal institutions. And so the fact that people are getting arrested is certainly in part due to the fact that the status quo authorities see people who are protesting inequality as being just kind of troublemakers and antagonizers and people who really deserve to be in jail. There's definitely that bias. But a part of it is that the occupations are by design be growing without legal sanction. And so the more threatening they become to those in power, I think it's just inevitable that those in power are going to start to treat it as being threatening and to use their force and coercion against it, which includes arrest. But the one thing I will say is that, by and large, although the media reaction has been quite negative and scornful and patronizing, polls continuously show that large pluralities, if not majorities, are sympathetic to the message of the Occupy movement, because most people do indeed know that our legal and political institutions are radically broken and that meaningful change is possible only by working outside of them.
Sure, and it's no surprise when we look over the years at polls, fairly asked polls asking people, do you think the government has a fundamental responsibility to provide you health care? And the overwhelming majority of people, usually 2/3 or even more, do think so, but you don't see that reflected in the politicians that are elected. You don't see that reflected in the policy that is proposed in any kind of serious way other than, every once in a while Dennis Kucinich mentioning it. So it should be no surprise to us that policy does not at all reflect the will of the people, does it?
Well, but this is, that's an important point about why the occupation movement has emerged and why it continues to flourish and the driving force behind it. Of course, politicians do go before the public and claim that they share the sentiments that polls reveal are embraced by majorities and promise to carry out that agenda. And huge numbers of people in 2008 were persuaded by the Obama campaign that electing Barack Obama would result in those policies being implemented. And in fact, I think the most significant thing about the 2008 campaign with respect to the Occupy Wall Street movement is that the Obama candidacy really specifically targeted those people who had decided that working within the political system was no longer worthwhile, or that who had always concluded that it wasn't worthwhile. People who, as Obama described them, were sort of wallowing in this corrosive cynicism. And that's what all of this, stuff about Yes We Can and Audacity of Hope was designed to do, was to persuade specifically those people that there was a reason, there was a value to them devoting their time, energy, and resources to electing a Democratic candidate, that things would actually change. And when they did that and they saw that nothing changed, that everything continued as is, that the same factions continued to be served, that was really what increased the cynicism more than it had ever existed before. And it's what led so many people to the conclusion, well, if it didn't happen here, it's never going to happen. And now I realize that the only viable course of action is to work outside of this system, is to dissent from it and to change the political culture rather than working for one party or the other. And I think that is a huge energy behind this movement, is the anger and disappointment and sense of betrayal that people feel from 2008.
My last question for you, Glenn, is do you think that Occupy Wall Street will play a real role in the 2012 election? And let me qualify that by saying I don't mean offhanded references from either or both candidates when it's politically convenient to mention Occupy Wall Street. But do you think in any real way this will affect the upcoming presidential election?
I do. I think it'll affect it in the sense that there'll be more rhetorical attention paid to the issue of wealth and income inequality, not just offhanded remarks as you suggested, but more time being spent on it, which is a positive thing. But I think the real impact that it possibly might have is that if the Obama campaign perceives, and I think this is the real risk that they're worried about already, that so much of the energy of the youth vote and the first-time vote that drove him into office in 2008 is instead being directed to the Occupy movement rather than the Obama re-election 2012 campaign, then I think there's going to be a serious effort on the part of Obama to at least create the appearance that he's more concerned with the issues that are occupying the occupation movement than he actually is. And so I think you're going to start to see some greater tactical shifts to target those people. But, ultimately, at the end of the day, both of those major party candidates are going to need to get funding from corporate and Wall Street interest, and that's the real constituency that they're going to end up serving. So the biggest impact may be on the fact that it just gives people another outlet besides electoral politics to express their discontent, and that could certainly have an impact on the outcome of the election.
Glenn Greenwald, of course, over at salon.com, and the new book is With Liberty and Justice for Some. Really great to talk to you, Glenn. Keep up the great work.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
It's time to answer your questions. We answer 3 audience questions every Friday at the end of the show. The first question is from Lucy. Lucy says, hey, David, is driving slowly in the left lane that big of a deal? I'm constantly getting headlights flashed at me and people honking at me. I have so much to say about this, Lewis, and I think you will too. Let me first state a congratulatory message to Lucy. The mere fact that you're aware that people are flashing their headlights and honking at you because you're going slowly in the left lane puts you so far ahead of so many people who simply have no idea that they are responsible for slowing down traffic on highways by going in what in the US is the fast lane, the left lane. Yes, it is a huge deal. The left lane should be used for passing. I recently read a study about actually how significant the impact on traffic can be from just one vehicle on a 2-lane highway going slowly in the left lane is. I cannot overstate the importance, Lewis, of following the rules of the road.
But I'm guessing she didn't know the rules of the road. The left lane is supposed to be used for passing. And of course, by driving slowly in the left-hand lane, you are not allowing anyone to pass anyone else.
And you are actually creating a dangerous scenario where people will start attempting to pass on the right, which of course, as you have on-ramps and off-ramps on the right lane, it's a recipe for disaster, and it is actually very, very dangerous.
I don't know why you need to drive slowly in the left-hand lane when you can do it in the proper lane. So from now on, just do it in the proper lane.
And the logic of this is so simple. You could create a flow chart, okay? You get onto the highway on the right lane. You try to get to the speed you would like to travel at. If you cannot travel at that speed because the car in front of you is going slowly, you switch to the left lane and pass the slower vehicle. Immediately, when you are done doing that, you move to the right lane. And the rules for the left lane are also very simple. If you are in the left lane and there is no one in front of you that you are driving faster than or trying to drive faster than, you should be back in the right lane. It's the logic of it is just so simple, and people do not seem to get it.
No, but like you said, it is great that you are aware that this was happening, and please correct it.
Second question this week is from Rick. Rick said, would you be in favor of a law that allows the owners of bars and restaurants to apply for a permit to allow smoking in their establishment if they want it? Because you mentioned freedom of the smoker, and you said the freedom of the non-smoker was not being considered, and I disagree. I think a permit which requires a very prominent sign at the entrance which says smoking allowed here, secondhand smoke has health risks would be put up, and owners could decide whether they want to have smoking or not. And the non-smoker has the freedom to go to another place that doesn't allow smoking, and smokers can go to the place that does. Stipulations of the permit could include you have to have one bar or restaurant within a certain radius that doesn't allow smoking so that freedom of choice remains intact. Rick says he lived in South Korea and that you could smoke in a lot of the local places, but not in the big chains. I would be absolutely against this, Lewis, and I can explain why, but first I'll defer to you. What's your thought?
I would be absolutely against this as well, because while your patrons, while the customers might be able to choose to go to a different restaurant, your employees might not be able to. And so they shouldn't have to inhale that disgusting, repulsive crap And so that's why I am against this.
Yeah, and Rick tries to kind of circumvent that argument by saying, hey, you could have in the law that you have to have in a certain radius a certain amount of places that don't have smoking in order to have one that does. That this is just so convoluted and ridiculous, and this is completely ignoring the reality that smoking is a harmful activity to others, and this thin veil of freedom of choice, because hey, the smokers can choose to go there, the non-smokers can choose to go there, and the owner can choose to either allow smoking or not allow smoking, and everybody simply has freedom. This is just not the case. And imagine the children of smokers or the children of non-smokers who go and are making decisions for them. The child is unable to decide for themselves whether they want to be around the smoke or not. As Lewis said, employees, if you say, well, they could just work somewhere else. No, the non-smoking bars don't need to hire an unlimited amount of people, right? At a certain point, you might have to take a job at the smoking place and to say, hey, the market will decide. If the job is if you need the job badly enough, the negative side effects of smoking will be something that you will just agree to tolerate. Nothing about this makes sense to me, and I completely agree with the laws in I don't know if it's all the U.S., Lewis. I mean, I know in Massachusetts and New York, certainly, you cannot smoke in bars, you cannot smoke in restaurants, full stop.
No, right in the county adjacent to mine here in Texas, you are allowed to smoke in I think all the bars.
Wow.
And so, yeah, no, there are plenty of places in the country where this is still allowed.
Freddie wrote in. Freddie said, are either of you still friends with people from elementary school, middle school, or your high school class? Yes, absolutely. I actually talked to many people who are not really in touch with any of their friends from when they were younger. Lewis and I met when we were 7 or 8. I was just at a friend of mine's wedding who we also met when I was 7. Another friend of mine that I met when I was 8. We have lunch every 2 weeks when I'm back in Massachusetts, certainly from middle school, high school. And I used to think that that was kind of a normal thing, but the more people I talk to, Lewis, the more people I meet that are no longer really in touch with friends that kind of predate college or at the very most high school.
Yeah, that's strange to me. I mean, the vast majority of the people I was very friendly with in elementary school, I'm still friendly with, and the same applies to middle school. But high school, perhaps not as much, but still plenty of friends there that I'm in touch with. And so, I mean, everyone's different. Some people move around more. Some people just don't maintain friendships as well.
Yeah, and I think that there is also something in the U.S. where in certain other countries, including in Europe, people tend to stay closer to where they grew up, and that might facilitate maintaining those kinds of relationships. Whereas in the U.S., it's far more common in my experience, my anecdotal experience, for people to have their parents in one state, their grandparents in a different state. They might be on a different coast altogether. It seems like being such a huge country and with so many different industries and areas of opportunity that are very spread out, you see less of that staying close to where you grew up. Although statistically speaking, people do end up within a few hours typically of where they grew up.
That is true. So, every situation's a little bit different. It could be societal. I don't really know.
Send me your thoughts on this. Tell us about you and where most of the people you're in touch with now, where in your life or at what point in your life you met them. But what you think in general of this kind of phenomenon that seems to exist, at least anecdotally. What a great Friday program, Lewis. Always enjoy answering audience questions. And very often we answer questions on the bonus show, which is hosted by producer Lewis. I am the sidekick. You can get access to the bonus show as a David Pakman Show member at davidpakman.com/membership.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.